Now, Lil Durk's federal trial finally kicked off a few days ago, with prosecutors accusing him of orchestrating a revenge plot against Quando Rondo, while Durk's lawyers say someone else was actually behind it. But just a few days into the trial, one of Durk's longtime friends took the stand and started telling the jury what he claims happened behind the scenes. That friend is Kacey Hester, better known as OTF Jam. The two have known each other for years, and their relationship continued even while Jam was serving a lengthy prison sentence. Jam says Durk stayed in contact with him, put money on his books, and even helped him with legal expenses. When Jam eventually came home, Durk was still around, welcoming him back and continuing that relationship. But in May 2023, Jam was arrested again, and according to Durk's defense team, shortly after that arrest, he began cooperating with authorities. So by the time the feds finally came for Durk, Jam had already been cooperating with authorities for well over a year. In other words, one of the people closest to Durk had already been talking to investigators long before Durk himself was ever taken into custody. Lil Durk's attorney, Marissa Goldberg, told the jury that Jam was desperate to avoid going back to prison, describing him as someone who eventually became what she called a massive cooperator. And that matters because a major part of the government's case against Durk now depends on people who agreed to cooperate. So here we are almost 2 years later after Durk's arrest, with someone who once stood beside Durk now sitting in court and pointing the finger at him. So Jam isn't the only one who's pointing the finger. Two other people charged in connection with the alleged plot, Kayvon Otiavani, Grant, and Keith Jones, have also pleaded guilty and agreed to work with prosecutors. But Jam was the first one to actually take the stand against Durk. Before we get into what he said, there's some context that matters here. Jam told the jury he was a member of the Black Disciples in Chicago and eventually rose into a leadership role through violence, including an attempted murder case that led to roughly 12 years in prison. He was released in February 2022, and Jam says Durk was there when he came home, welcoming him back and even buying him clothes. Later that same year, the situation around Durk and Quando Rondo started moving in a completely different direction. Just as a quick refresher, prosecutors believe King Von's death eventually became the motive for a revenge plot against Quando Rondo. The government says Durk became consumed with getting payback and eventually used his money and position to help make that retaliation happen. Durk's lawyers completely deny that and say prosecutors are trying to turn his grief and anger into evidence of a crime. That's where Jam's testimony comes in. So Jam testified that on August 18, 2022, one day before Lil Pab was killed, he suddenly got a call from an associate telling him to get on a flight from Chicago to California that same day. Jam also said that during another call with that same associate, he could hear Durk's voice in the background. At that point, he says he still didn't know why he was being sent out there. He didn't even pack a bag, he just got on a flight and landed in San Diego. Once he arrived, Jam says he learned what the trip was actually about: finding and killing Quando Rondo. And prosecutors say there's another piece of evidence that ties directly into the timing of that trip. The jury was shown a text Durk allegedly sent on August 18, 2022, the same day Jam says he was suddenly told to fly out to California. In that message, Durk wrote, "Don't book no flights under no names involved with me." Prosecutors are using that message as evidence that Durk knew about the travel, while also giving instructions about how those flights should be booked. Prosecutors also told the jury that by that point, Durk allegedly knew Quando Rondo was in Los Angeles and believed it was time to get revenge for King Von's death. And then there's another message from almost a year later that prosecutors say shows Durk already suspected Jam might eventually cooperate. In an August 2023 group chat, Durk allegedly warned that Jam was going to tell soon. Durk then allegedly added that as long as everyone else stays solid, Jam could tell authorities whatever he wanted. Now, Jam also told some very specific things that happened during the orchestration of this entire plot. He testified that guns and vehicles were provided as the group prepared to head toward Los Angeles. Jam says they eventually tracked Quando Rondo that night, and according to his testimony, they were prepared to act, but backed off because there were too many police officers around. So, nothing happened that particular night, but the next day, everything changed. The following day, Quando Rondo and Lil Pab were at a gas station near the Beverly Center when gunfire broke out, killing Lil Pab while Quando survived. And then Jam is now telling the jury that the shooting was connected to the same alleged plan he says he learned about when he arrived in California. And this is where his testimony became especially important for the case against Durk. So this longtime associate of Durk, Jam, isn't simply telling the jury that a plan existed. He's giving prosecutors an inside account of how he says the plan unfolded. And prosecutors are using Jam's testimony about Durk's alleged involvement before and during the trip to argue that Durk was connected to what was happening behind the scenes. But even with Jam's testimony, there's still an important distinction. Being connected to people involved in the alleged plot is not by itself proof that Durk ordered a murder. This is why his testimony matters so much. If the jury believes what he's saying, prosecutors have someone from inside the alleged plot directly connecting Durk to what was happening. If they don't believe him, that part of the government's case becomes much harder to prove. So according to his testimony, Durk had already made his feelings about Quando clear before the trip ever happened. He told the jury about an earlier conversation in Atlanta where he says Durk talked about retaliation against Quando and Lil Tim. And this matters because prosecutors say revenge is the motive behind the entire case. Their argument is that Durk's comments about retaliation weren't just talk. They were part of the build-up to what happened next. The sequence prosecutors are presenting is simple. Durk allegedly talks about retaliation. Jam is suddenly called out to California. He says the group starts looking for Quando, and the next day, Lil Pab is killed. That's the chain they want the jury to accept. However, Durk's defense team is attacking the person connecting those events. Jam admits he was involved. He later began cooperating with authorities, and his testimony could potentially help him in his own case. The defense is also focusing on how extensively he worked with investigators before taking a stand. During the investigation into Durk, his longtime friend OTF Jam was interviewed around 30 times, but only 3 of those meetings were recorded. Durk's lead defense attorney, Brian Steele, brought that up during cross-examination and pressed investigators on why the other interviews weren't recorded. The detective said he couldn't speculate about why so many of those interviews weren't recorded, while also acknowledging that he personally preferred interviews to be recorded. Steele then asked whether recording an interview was the best way to preserve exactly what was said, and the detective agreed. So for Durk's defense, that creates another issue with Jam's testimony. He was interviewed dozens of times before taking a stand, but there isn't a complete recording of most of those conversations. That gives Durk's lawyers room to question how Jam's account developed across all of those meetings and how much weight the jury should give the version they're hearing now. And that's really the defense strategy with Jam. Not necessarily proving that he's lying, but giving the jury reasons to question how much they should trust him. And Durk's lawyers say Jam isn't the only person with a reason to shift blame. They told jurors that another man involved in the case was originally viewed by investigators as the person in charge of the shooting. But after he was arrested, the defense says he realized cooperation could help him and eventually started telling investigators that he had been acting on Durk's instructions. So if you notice, a lot of these guys who were involved in this alleged plot, whenever anything comes back to them, they just put the blame on Durk and they're blaming him as the actual mastermind behind everything. Now, Durk's legal team say that account is false, arguing that prosecutors were looking for a bigger target and Durk became the big fish. Durk's lawyers are also trying to separate him from the actual planning of the alleged hit, but prosecutors aren't relying on Jam's testimony alone. The jury has also been shown messages Durk sent after King Von was killed. Messages the government says help establish a motive for retaliation. In those messages, Durk talked about Von's death changing him, saying he was dead inside, that he couldn't let what happened slide, and that it was turning him into a different animal. Prosecutors are using those words to argue that Durk's grief eventually became a desire for revenge. And that's where Jam's testimony fits into the bigger picture. The messages are being used to establish what prosecutors say was the motive. Jam is being used to tell the jury what he claims happened afterward. Put those two things together, and that's the case prosecutors are trying to build against Durk. So on one side, you have someone who has known Durk for years now sitting in court and giving prosecutors an inside scoop of what he says happened. And then on the other side, Durk's lawyers are basically telling the jury, look at who this information is coming from. This is somebody who got arrested himself, started cooperating, met with investigators dozens of times, and has potentially something to gain from helping the government. I think there's a bigger lesson in this whole situation about trust. You can know somebody for years, help them, bring them around you, and still never really know what happens once real pressure gets put on that relationship. At the same time though, Durk was allegedly moving pretty sloppy in some of these situations. I mean, you have alleged text messages, phone calls, travel, people around him, conversations, all these different pieces that prosecutors are now trying to put together in front of a jury. And according to the prosecutors, they say that Durk was consumed by revenge and retaliation. So even if you put the whole conversation about loyalty and betrayal to the side for a second, you also have to ask how much of the situation could have been avoided by simply moving differently in the first place. And it's also interesting how some of these people who are involved are painting the narrative in a way where they're completely absolving accountability from themselves. I mean, honestly, who really catches a flight without knowing exactly why you're going to the place you're going to. So the whole thing obviously doesn't make any sense. I'm not saying that Durk is innocent, but clearly anyone who testifies against Durk, of course, has their own motive, which in the end is to save themselves. But that's where I personally land on what I've heard so far. But I'm curious what you guys think. One of his associates has now officially testified against him in court, and depending who the jury believes and what prosecutors are actually able to prove, this testimony could end up becoming one of the most defining moments of the entire trial. I guess we'll see. You guys let me know what you think down below. If you made it this far, drop a like on this video and subscribe if you're new here. Appreciate you guys for watching. And like always, I'll catch you guys on the next one. Peace, I'm out.